And there's also now a greater reliance on this trickle-down theory. This idea that if you just grow the economy, okay, the rich get richer, but some sort of falls off and it's grabbed by the poor. So that overcomes the problem of people becoming poor. So we don't have to rely as much on redistribution mechanisms. That seems to be an approach that is being used more and more. The problem with that is, of course, not all poor can pick up these pieces, not in a position to pick up these pieces, and even if they can, it leads to an accelerated division between rich and poor. Hence the reason for the increase in income inequality in Australia. Oh, may I say, when there's a lot of talk about the inequalities, most of the focus is on income. There is a much greater degree of inequality in terms of the ownership of wealth. The greatest redistribution of wealth in Australia has occurred in the last 10 years. If you owned a house fully paid off 10 years ago, there has been a massive redistribution of wealth in your direction. Your house has probably tripled, quadrupled in value. You've done perhaps nothing, but perhaps maintain it to some extent. That means that you've increased your claim on the remainder of wealth if you sell your house by 4 times what it was 10 years ago without having done anything. So that means because of the real estate boom, there's a massive redistribution of wealth towards those who own property and away from those who don't. Most of the emphasis is on income, but in fact the greatest degree of inequality is in relation to wealth. Okay, so economists generally would argue that there is a problem with markets straying into the policy area of distribution. Where they will disagree with the ecological economic sort of position is in relation to markets and ecological sustainability. They think that you can solve the sustainability problem by allowing things to be determined by the market. So the question might be, why can't we just leave the sustainability issue to markets? And I'll tell you why. For the markets to succeed, resource prices must reflect absolute scarcity. Sustainability is a problem about the absolute scarcity of resources, of waste sinks and life support services. By absolute scarcity, I mean how much there is of a particular resource, as well as the total of all useful resources. Right? So prices could reflect absolute scarcity. We could perhaps use and rely upon markets to solve the sustainability issue. The problem is that resource prices only reflect relative scarcity. I'll just explain it. By relative scarcity, I mean how much there is of a particular resource relative to another type of resource. Market prices only tell you how scarce something is relative to something else, not how scarce it is overall. And I was just talking to someone about Paul Ehrlich. Paul Ehrlich had that famous bet, I don't know if you remember that, with Julian Simon. About $10,000 that they put on the line. I think it was about 1980. Julian Simon, Paul Ehrlich, who was a biologist. People are aware of Paul. He wrote The Population Bomb. He was very influential in the late 60s, early 70s. He's still doing a lot of work. He went into a bet with Julian Simon, who was the technological optimist of all technological optimists. And he said, we're running out of these resources. I'll put $10,000 on the line that the prices of about 10 particular resources will go up because they're becoming more scarce. Paul Ehrlich lost the bet. The prices actually went down. What Paul Ehrlich failed to realise is because, and this is no criticism of Paul Ehrlich because he's a brilliant man, but he's a biologist, not an economist, and he fell into the trick of thinking that prices reflect absolute scarcity. We're told that when a resource becomes more scarce, its price goes up. It's not the case at all. Eventually it will, but in the short run, in the medium term, it is possible for the price of a resource to actually fall. And the best way to think of this is to imagine a hypothetical example. Let's imagine that there is no oil discovery or discoveries anywhere in the world for the next 12 months, and all OPEC countries doubled their output of oil. Presumably, the amount of oil that known reserves would fall. What would we expect to happen to the price of oil? Everyone would say the price will go down, you'll flood the market with oil. But hang on, the stock's fallen. In the short run, what can happen? It's a complicated argument, but there's these flow side effects and stock effects that affect market prices. ultimately, in the long run, it becomes very difficult to supply a particular resource when you've got to go to the North Sea, to the deserts of the Middle East or Alaska or wherever to get oil, but not quite yet. But it may be happening now with oil prices starting to go up. When you've got to go a long way to get a particular resource, eventually the cost of having to go a long way, the stock effect, the dwindling stock effect, starts to put upward pressure on prices. But in the short term, when you've still got this stuff reasonably available, you've got reasonable access to it, you can flood the market with it, and the immediate supply of that resource causes the price to go down. So even though the overall stock can fall, the price can actually fall, not actually rise. And so for that reason, you cannot look at a resource price and say, because that price is going down, it's obviously less scarce than it was. We must have discovered some more of it. Or if it's a renewable resource, more of it grew. It grew faster than we extracted it. We cannot obtain any information about the absolute scarcity of resources from resource prices. So for that reason, the market cannot be relied upon to ensure the sustainable use and availability of resources. But of course, that's just one aspect of the sustainability issue that I've talked about earlier on. There's three aspects. There's the resource availability, there's the waste side, and the life support function of natural capital. As far as the waste problem goes, there are no natural markets for waste at all. So whilst there are reasonably natural markets for resources, and at best, if they're working well, they'll give you an indication of relative scarcity, but not absolute scarcity, and that's not good enough. In terms of waste, they don't give us any information at all, unless we create markets, which we can do through assignment of property rights and so on, but that runs into problems. There's problems of transaction costs, information problems, such as who is generating the waste that's affecting me? Okay, so if all of a sudden Adelaide, which relies heavily upon the River Murray for its water, the water could no longer be used because there's some pollutant coming down the river, the question would be asked, if we allowed everything to be determined not by the market, not by government, we'd have to get together and say, now who is the bugger up the river who's putting all this pollution into the river? We'd have to become informed. There's huge transaction costs and so on, and we wouldn't necessarily know the actual source of the problem. So the market wouldn't work very well for waste in this situation. Even if they did work well, of course, they'll only reflect the relative scarcity of the various waste sinks, not the absolute scarcity. And again, it's the absolute scarcity of waste sinks that are important. And of course, you can't create private property rights for some waste sinks, atmosphere and seas. What about the life support service? Well, there are no markets whatsoever, and it's virtually impossible to create markets for them. Hence, life support services tend to go unpriced and are ignored in economic decision making. Overall, the role of markets should be confined to increasing allocative efficiency, nothing else. With governments intervening in terms of public goods, information, imperfect competition, natural monopolies and externalities to overcome market failure. Making markets work better, but only in terms of that policy area number 3, efficient allocation. Distribution and sustainability, leave markets out altogether. So to achieve sustainability, now again, an oversimplification, what we really need to do is rather than allowing things to be determined by the market, we need to place throughput controls on the rate of renewable resource extraction. Now we're starting to, some people I'm sure won't be in total agreement with the idea of a cap and trade system, but a cap and trade system deals with this to some extent. A cap is effectively equivalent to a throughput control. You're limiting the amount that you extract from a river basin or from a forest or from the seas if we're talking about fish and so on. Now you might say, well, that's sort of a market sort of mechanism because they can trade in the right, but if the cap and trade system is designed properly, you would set a limit on the number of rights or permits to extract a particular resource, which would be equivalent to a throughput control. But that's not really the use of the market. I mean, you might then be able to trade the rights, but that's something different altogether. Actually placing a restriction on the number of rights is equivalent to going outside the market. The market wouldn't determine that. That has to be done outside the market. The market won't place the limit. If we relied on resource prices, given that resource prices don't reflect absolute scarcity, the market wouldn't set that limit. We've got to do it ourselves with a cap and trade system. That's why you'll find in the future, with a bit of luck, we'll see a lot more of this use of cap and trade system. It's really the only way to ensure sustainability, in my opinion.